I have a big picture question for you. You know, your generation was shaped by the World War II generation that lived in anti-access area denial and had to operate in a very challenging environment. Then that led into a Cold War, which was an entire sweep of anti-access area denial operations. And then your generation was in Vietnam, but that was sort of an extension of it, right? Counterinsurgency war on the ground, but in the air, you guys were fighting cutting-edge Soviet weapons, you know, whether, you know, and so many other airmen were shot down by very sophisticated, high-altitude surface-to-air missiles. You guys had a kind of a combat operational ethos. Since 1990, the U.S. Air Force has been engaged in continuous operation, but most of that has been over permissive airspace. Does the Air Force now have that kind of ethos? Is that ethos difficult to rebuild? Great commanders, thoughtful folks, excellent training, great equipment. But is there an ethos difference today that existed in your generation that may be a little bit harder to instill in this generation that hasn't seen that kind of environment?
Well, I'm not sure I see it exactly the same way that you described it, Margot. I think what we saw in Vietnam was the kind of the culmination of American air power at the height of its limitations, okay? So what we ended up doing in Vietnam is we ended up fighting with what I call several sanctuaries, okay? There was a sanctuary that was provided by night. I mean, we just didn't have the technological equipment to fight at night. The best we could generally do was fight under flares, drop flares. So night was a sanctuary. And if the weather moved in, weather was a sanctuary for the enemy. That gave them a chance to run things because we couldn't see them, we couldn't get at them. And so you have night, you have weather, you had concealment, you know, a lot of camouflage, a lot of stuff like that. And we also then, for the first time, at least for the first time since the Second World War, which was a little bit different, but we, for the first time in Vietnam, ran into a truly integrated, highly effective air defense system. And to a certain degree, we took on that challenge. We went in and we flew into the north in the face of that, but we were not as effective because we had to develop tactics to work around this sort of thing. And I think to the credit of the United States Air Force and to a certain level of leadership, and I was certainly not part of this, but I was a beneficiary of it. After we came out of Vietnam, the R&D community in the Air Force started to work on these sanctuaries. And as a result of that, and we began to see equipment come on board. The Lantern, low altitude night infrared. Boy, that opened the night up to us. We had millimeter wave kinds of things that would take away the sanctuary, if you will. We ended up with precision munitions that could be employed through weather. We ended up with aircraft like J-stars and that could see movement through the weather. And so we came out of Vietnam and went into a period of time in which the United States Air Force research and development community produced the weapons that and then the other thing that came along, of course, was precision. And the precision came out of primarily GPS and GPS-enabled weapons. And as part of this, how do we defeat an integrated air defense, we had the development of stealth. And all this occurs basically between 1975 and when we go to war in the Gulf.
And it's the second offset strategy.
Exactly. And so what happens is really nobody knew, you know, nobody recognized what had happened. And so here we are, you know, we go in there, we conduct an air campaign that totally obliterates a fairly sophisticated enemy, and it leads to a relatively quick ground campaign that ends up in a victory. And so, to me, it wasn't thinking so much about anti-access aerial denial as I started thinking about it from sanctuaries. But now you're back to the other guy has figured this out, and so he's trying to do things to give him new sanctuaries. And those sanctuaries show up. They are things that we have to penetrate. We have to find a way to defeat them. And so what has been going on since the first Gulf War in terms of operating in a basically benign or environment where we have air superiority is we have been riding on the wave of these innovations that occurred after Vietnam. And I think this generation has an appreciation for what's required. My fear is that you build anti-access aerial denial into such a big bugaboo that you don't go fight. In spite of all those sanctuaries they had, we still took the fight to them. And I think that's a case of what we've got to keep in mind that the Secretary had a wonderful, wonderful statement today in her speech. She said, make no mistake, if we are asked to go into combat and we are not at the readiness level we would like to be, or we don't have the modern equipment we want to have, we will go. The difference is the number of people who will come back. And I think that's the thing that needs to be driving people as we look at anti-access area denial things. We are going to go. It is a question of, can we do the innovative modernization that is required to make sure that our people come back?
Let me ask you about that. You were, as chief, you launched one of probably the most ambitious relooks at technology since Theodore von Karman did in 1947 when the Air Force was born. That scientific advisory board study mapped a whole series of technologies that have become a reality. I remember being at the when you launched it, and I remember when you noted the notion of operators being somewhere in the United States operating over enemy territory anywhere on the planet. And you said, as somebody who had been shot down, there's really no romantic notion about that. You should be very realistic, and if we can project power, that should be the key. You also talked about the latter blocks of F-35 will likely be autonomous, you said, which at the time folks thought was unreasonable, but there is some thinking about that in terms of capabilities. Talk to us a little bit about, as somebody who's kept their hand in both as, on the industry side, but certainly on the Air Force side of things, where do you see air power going in this next phase? Much more contested. Chinese and Russians, the last administration was working very hard on the third offset strategy innovation initiatives. I know that you were involved in discussing and working on some of those. Secretary Mattis has embraced both of those calls going forward. Where do you see the future of air combat and how the United States needs to position itself in that environment as you look forward another 20 years?
Well, let me step back if I can. Again, I'm going to reference the Secretary's speech today, but I'll come to that in a minute. As you mentioned, Hap Arnold at the end of the Second World War met with von Karman and asked him to go off and bring the scientific community together. And so what we ended up with was a study that was called Toward New Horizons, okay? And it became the template for post-World War II, the development of the things that we really saw during the Cold War. It was an important piece of work. And so it had sort of run its course when I became the chief. And we had a lot of great dynamics going on. We were first of all, you go back to when Don Rice was Secretary of the Air Force and General McPeak, Tony McPeak was the chief. Don Rice, primarily the Secretary, drove us as the Cold War came to an end and the Soviet Union disintegrated. He drove us to start thinking, what is the Air Force going to do for the nation in a post-Cold War environment? And that's when we came up with, and I say we, but it was primarily Rice who came up with global reach, global power, okay? We were the only service, we were the first service to do this in the early 1990s, to look at how we had to change. And he was fortunate in that he had a chief who was forceful, innovative, and thought like him with General McPeak. And so Rice had the idea. Peak was the guy that could execute it. And that was what led to the breakup of old Tactical Air Command and old SAC and MAC and all that. And we then restructured ourselves because the essence of what we were going to see in the post-Cold War environment is, by and large, the United States of America was going to become a CONUS-based force that would go forward in contingencies. So we had to structure ourselves in a way that would support that. And so that's what led to that reorganization. Now, so I inherited that thought process when I became the chief. And the one thing that we had not done to marry up, what we ought to look like is what should be our priorities going forward into the 21st century. And so both Secretary Widnall and I believed that it was time for another deep dive into strategic planning, into long-range vision and all that. And so that's when we actually got Dr. Gene McCall to come in and head the effort up. And the study became known as New World Vistas. And the idea was to look out to 2025 and try to think about what is going to be different about the environment, the technology, the applications, and things of that nature. And that was the foundation, if you will, why we went and looked at that. Now, back to the Secretary's speech today. The most salient point of all her speech today was she announced that she and the chief are kicking off a new long-range look at science, technology, and that. So there will be a third chapter in this thing, and it's time.
Where do you think it's going to go? What do you think the key points of that are going to be as you look forward 20 years?
Well, the older you get, the cloudier your crystal ball gets. But I think that certainly cyberspace is a big deal and continues to be a bigger deal. To me, the understanding of the power of cyber forces today is about where we were in the mid and early 80s in terms of the general force understanding space and the capabilities that space enabled, if you will. So I think cyber will be a lot of that. I think that that you're going to see a lot of new technology in materials. Okay, even in New World Vistas, we talked a little bit about that, but that's really now starting to come to fruition. There's a company out there that I'm aware of that is building a factory from the ground up that has a technique that takes aluminum, makes it as strong as steel, no increase in weight. Now that's a kind of a breakthrough. And I'm involved with a couple of different companies that do composite stuff. I think
and we should say that you're the Orbital ATK chairman, so congratulations on,
yeah.
being bought by Northrop today.
Well,
but I'll ask you about that in a minute.
That's part of that trip that you go on where you say, okay, maybe it really is a lifetime achievement. Maybe I'm about to get displaced from one more job. But the fact of the matter is, I think cyber, I think space, there's so many interesting things happening there. I think the idea of, there is no new technology required to get yourself to a position where you can have multispectral constellations on orbit that will give you, on a 24-hour a day, 7 days a week, down to 1 meter, maybe less, resolution, every spot on the face of the Earth. Every spot on the face of the Earth. All the technology you need to do that with is at a, it's at a technology readiness level of 8. It just takes, the management. So I think space will continue. And hey, there's going to be air breathing. Look at the tanker force. The tanker force enables not only the United States Air Force with its global reach and all this, those aircraft on aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean or in the Gulf, they're worthless without our tankers. There would have been no naval, marine air in Afghanistan without our tankers. And it's an underappreciated force, but it's why we have to recapitalize something like tankers. Something as mundane as airlift, C-130s, C-17, C-5, the craft, all that's going to remain relevant as we go forward. The special ops folks, I think the same thing. What we need is to continue to push technology, research and development, but what we really need is agility of mind on how we use people. That's where we're lagging, I think, in being able to apply the advances that we're going to make in machinery.
What's the change that's needed in your view?
Well, I think we need to have greater flexibility in terms of career paths and regular reserve guard, all this sort of thing, where people can come in and out. They can take sabbaticals. They can go develop. For instance, in the cyber world, you can go out, work for industry for a while, come back, do things like that. We just need greater flexibility.